The late summer sun cast long shadows across the parched earth of the El Paso Valley as Laura Anderson guided her horse along the narrow trail leading to her family's farmstead. At 17, she'd grown accustomed to the harsh beauty of the desert frontier, where even the hardy mesquite struggled to survive. Her father, Frank, had chosen this remote plot of land 5 years ago, convinced that irrigation from the nearby springs would transform the arid soil into fertile growing ground. So far, his stubborn determination had proven right, though every season brought new challenges. High above, a red-tailed hawk traced lazy circles against the cloudless sky, its piercing cry echoing off the distant cliffs. Laura had always felt a peculiar connection to the wild creatures that called this unforgiving land home. While other settlers viewed them as either threats or resources to be exploited, she saw something more in their eyes, an intelligence and dignity that few bothered to notice. Her mother Margaret often said Laura had been blessed with her grandmother's gift for understanding animals, though Laura wasn't sure she believed in such things. The peaceful afternoon shattered as gunshots rang out from the direction of town. Laura pulled her horse to a stop, straining to hear more. El Paso had grown increasingly lawless in recent months, ever since Marshal Daniel Clark had taken over from the previous lawman. Though her father spoke carefully around her, Laura had overheard enough conversations between him and the other farmers to know something wasn't right with the new marshal and his deputies. The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent Laura ducking behind a stand of scrub brush. Through the thorny branches, she watched as three riders thundered past, their horses lathered with sweat. She recognized Robert Walker, one of Clark's deputies, but the others were strangers. Rough-looking men whose very presence seemed to darken the air around them. They carried bulging saddlebags and kept looking over their shoulders as they rode, as if expecting pursuit. As the dust settled in their wake, a new sound reached Laura's ears, a low whimpering coming from a shallow wash nearby. Carefully dismounting, she crept toward the source of the noise. There, half hidden behind a boulder, lay a young Native American woman no older than herself. She wore the distinctive dress of the Comanche, though her clothes were torn and bloodied. An arrow shaft protruded from her shoulder, and her dark eyes were glazed with pain. Laura's heart raced as she approached the injured woman. Relations between settlers and the Comanche remained tense, despite recent peace treaties. But she couldn't simply leave someone to suffer, regardless of their heritage. As she drew closer, movement in the brush caught her attention. A pair of wolves had also noticed the wounded woman, and were slowly circling closer, drawn by the scent of blood. Their yellow eyes gleamed with predatory intent. Without hesitation, Laura positioned herself between the wolves and the injured woman. She'd dealt with their kind before when they threatened the farm's livestock. Keeping her movements slow and deliberate, she drew the heavy knife from her belt. The larger wolf, the alpha, curled its lip in a snarl, but Laura held her ground. Time seemed to stretch like molten glass as human and predator locked eyes in an ancient contest of wills. Then, to Laura's astonishment, the alpha wolf's posture changed. Its snarl faded, replaced by an almost questioning tilt of its head. Laura felt something brush against her consciousness. Not words exactly, but impressions. Curiosity, respect, and eventually, acceptance. The wolf turned away, its companion following, and they melted back into the desert scrub as silently as they had appeared. Laura stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. The injured woman watched this exchange with evident wonder. When Laura knelt beside her, she spoke in halting English. "I am Jumping Deer, daughter of Chief Black Cloud. You have the spirit touch. I saw how you spoke to the wolves without words. Help me reach my people, and I will teach you to use this gift." Or, Laura's world tilted on its axis as she realized her life would never be quite the same after this moment. As Laura worked to stabilize the arrow wound, Jumping Deer explained in whispered bursts that she had witnessed Marshal Clark and his men meeting with renegade warriors who had broken from her father's leadership. They were planning something that would shatter the fragile peace between settlers and Comanche. When they spotted her watching, Deputy Walker had shot her with an arrow from her own people's quiver, a clear attempt to blame her death on tribal infighting. The sun was sinking toward the horizon as Laura helped Jumping Deer onto her horse. They needed to reach the Comanche camp before nightfall, but returning to the farm to explain her absence wasn't an option. Her father would try to stop her, and there wasn't time. The Marshals' conspiracy had to be exposed before it sparked a war that would destroy everything and everyone she loved. Laura took one last look at the familiar trail home, then turned her horse toward the darkening mountains where the Comanche made their camp. As they rode, Laura became aware of subtle changes in her perception. The desert itself seemed to whisper to her. The rustle of a snake through grass carrying clear warning. The call of a coyote rich with meaning. Jumping deer smiled knowingly when Laura mentioned these sensations. The spirit touch grows stronger, she said. The animals recognize a friend. You will need their help for what is to come. Laura nodded grimly, knowing this was just the beginning of a much larger adventure. The desert wind carried whispers of danger as Laura and Jumping Deer made their way through the rocky terrain. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, and Laura found herself understanding its cry. There were riders approaching from the east, at least 4 of them. She shared this information with Jumping Deer, who nodded gravely. They needed to find cover, and quickly. The gift of animal speech was still new to Laura, but already it had proven invaluable. They guided their horses into a narrow canyon, where the towering walls provided shelter from prying eyes. The sound of hoofbeats echoed in the distance, and Laura felt her heart racing. A small desert mouse scurried past her boot, its tiny voice clear as a bell. Bad men coming, smell of metal and smoke. Laura knew what that meant. Guns. The Marshals' men had to be looking for Jumping Deer, hoping to silence her before she could reveal their plan to incite war by raiding both settler and Comanche camps while disguised as the opposing side. The canyon opened into a hidden valley where a small spring bubbled up through the rocks. Their horses drank gratefully while Laura and Jumping Deer discussed their options. The Comanche camp was still several hours away, and the sun was sinking rapidly. A family of coyotes denned nearby, shared news of a patrol of white men checking all the trails leading to the Comanche territory. The Marshals' reach was longer than they'd suspected. There is another way, Jumping Deer said softly, tracing a path on the ground with a stick. Through the spirit caves. Few know of them, but the old ones used them to travel unseen. Laura hesitated. She'd heard tales of those caves, how they twisted beneath the earth like serpents, how men had entered and never returned. But a mourning dove landed nearby, cooing gently about safe passages and ancient paths, and Laura found her fear subsiding. They left the horses concealed in the valley with clear instructions from Laura to run home if trouble came. The cave entrance was barely visible, hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines. Inside, the air was cool and still, with strange markings on the walls that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Jumping Deer produced a small torch, and they began their journey underground. Laura's newfound connection to the animals proved crucial. Bats guided them through the twisting passages, while tiny cave-dwelling creatures warned of unstable ground. As they moved deeper into the earth, Jumping Deer shared more about the Marshals' scheme. His name was Robert, and he'd been systematically destroying evidence of his corruption for months. But he'd made a crucial mistake when his men attacked Jumping Deer's hunting party. She'd recognized one of them as Frank, a deputy who frequently visited the trading post near her people's camp. The pieces had started coming together after that. The cave system was vast, but their small guides kept them on track. Laura thought of her father, Henry, probably worried sick by now. He was a good man who'd taught her to judge people by their actions, not their origins. That's why he'd traded fairly with the Comanche, while other settlers spread lies and hatred. She prayed he would understand why she had to do this. A distant rumble echoed through the caves, and their bat guides became agitated. "Storm coming," they squeaked, "water rising." Laura translated for Jumping Deer, and they quickened their pace. The caves had survived countless floods, but that didn't mean they wanted to be caught in one. The natural corridors began sloping upward, and Laura could smell rain on the air. They were getting close to another exit. They emerged into a small box canyon just as the first heavy drops began to fall. The Comanche camp was less than an hour away now, but the storm would make travel dangerous. A golden eagle soared past, warning of flash floods in the lowlands. They would have to wait it out. Jumping Deer found them shelter beneath an overhanging rock, where they could watch the rain transform the desert into flowing ribbons of red mud. In the enforced pause, Laura's mind turned to what awaited them. Marshal Robert had powerful friends in Dodge City, and his word carried weight with the territorial governor. They would need more than just Jumping Deer's testimony to expose his crimes. As if reading her thoughts, A prairie falcon landed nearby, shaking water from its feathers. It had seen men burying something in the shadows of Devil's Rock just 2 nights past. Laura listened intently as the bird described the location. Perhaps there they would find the proof they needed. Laura Anderson never expected her gift of speaking with animals would lead her into uncovering corruption in El Paso's law enforcement. But as she rode her painted mare along the scorching desert trail, the whispers of coyotes and hawks had warned her of something sinister brewing. The local wildlife spoke of men in badges doing midnight runs, of stolen cattle being moved under cover of darkness, and of Native Americans being framed for crimes they didn't commit. 3 months had passed since she'd saved the Comanche princess from the wolf pack, earning her mysterious ability. While most folks in El Paso knew Laura as the quiet daughter of Henry Anderson, the struggling wheat farmer, none suspected she spent her nights conversing with desert creatures, learning their secrets. Her father worried about her frequent solitary rides, but she couldn't explain that every jackrabbit and horned toad had become her informant. Sheriff Frank Taylor maintained a sterling reputation in town, but the animals told a different story. Laura had pieced together troubling patterns from their accounts, cattle mysteriously disappearing from small ranches, only to reappear on land owned by the sheriff's brother Robert Taylor. The desert creatures witnessed it all, from the midnight cattle drives to the threats made against farmers who asked too many questions. Daniel Moore, a young deputy who'd recently arrived from Dodge City, had caught Laura's attention. Unlike the other lawmen, the animals spoke well of him. How he'd leave water out for strays and never drew his gun unnecessarily. When their paths crossed in town, Laura sensed he too harbored suspicions about the sheriff, though neither dared speak them aloud. The corruption ran too deep, with too many powerful men involved. One sweltering afternoon, a golden eagle Laura had befriended brought urgent news. Sheriff Taylor and his men were planning to raid the Clark family farm that night, intending to plant evidence of cattle rustling. Martha Clark, the widow who owned the property, had refused to sell her land to Robert Taylor despite mounting pressure. Laura knew she had to act, but revealing her source of information would make her sound insane. She confided in Deputy Moore, carefully framing her knowledge as rumors heard around town. To her relief, Daniel didn't dismiss her concerns. He'd been building his own case against the sheriff, documenting suspicious patterns and missing evidence. Together, they formulated a plan to catch Taylor and his corrupt deputies in the act. Though Laura kept her unique advantage secret even from her new ally, the desert itself seemed to conspire to help them. Coyotes pledged to create diversions, drawing away Taylor's lookouts. Owls offered to watch the back roads and signal approaching riders. Even the snakes agreed to keep watch over specific trails, their network of eyes and ears becoming Laura's secret weapon against the corrupt law enforcement that had terrorized El Paso's honest citizens. As dusk approached, Laura positioned herself near the Clark farm, hidden among the rocky outcroppings. Deputy Moore waited separately, having arranged for trusted witnesses from Cheyenne to be present. The animals had gone unusually quiet, the calm before the storm. She felt the weight of her father's old rifle across her lap, praying she wouldn't need to use it. The desert wind carried whispers of approaching horses. Sheriff Taylor arrived with 4 deputies, all carrying suspicious bundles. Laura's heart raced as she watched them approach the Clark farm under cover of darkness. Through her connection with a nearby horned owl, she monitored their movements precisely. The moment Taylor's men began planting evidence in Martha Clark's barn, Daniel gave the signal. The trap was sprung, but what happened next would change El Paso forever. The night erupted into chaos as honest lawmen from Cheyenne emerged from hiding. Laura's animal allies played their parts perfectly. Coyotes spooked the corrupt deputies' horses, while a swarm of bats created disorienting confusion. In the ensuing chaos, Sheriff Taylor revealed his true nature, shooting wildly at shadows while his scheme crumbled around him. Laura watched it all through the eyes of her animal friends, silently orchestrating their assistance. Among the witnesses was Charlie Walker, a newspaperman from Deadwood who'd been investigating similar corruption cases across the territory. The evidence gathered that night, combined with Deputy Moore's documentation and Walker's wider investigation, would expose a network of corruption extending far beyond El Paso. Laura's gift had helped bring justice, though she would never reveal exactly how she'd known where to look. As dawn broke over the desert, Sheriff Taylor and his corrupt deputies faced justice. Daniel Moore was appointed interim sheriff, promising to restore honor to the badge. Laura watched from the shadows as Martha Clark's property was secured, knowing her animal friends would keep watching, ready to sound the alarm if new threats emerged. The desert had many more secrets to share, and Laura Anderson would be listening. The summer heat bore down mercilessly as Laura made her daily rounds checking on Martha Clark's recovering property. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, her eyes in the sky that had proven invaluable during the corruption scandal. Through their silent communication, Laura learned of riders approaching from the north, a small group moving with purpose through the desert scrubland. The hawk's warning gave her time to prepare, and soon she recognized Charlie Walker's distinctive gait among the approaching horsemen. The newspaper man had returned to El Paso, this time accompanied by 2 U.S. Marshals. Their presence suggested the corruption case had grown beyond local jurisdiction, just as Laura had suspected when she first began unraveling Sheriff Taylor's schemes. Daniel Moore, now serving as interim sheriff, met the group at Martha's ranch house. Laura watched from the shade of the adobe porch as the men dismounted, their expressions grave. Through whispered conversations with the mice that made their home in the walls, she learned that similar patterns of corruption had been uncovered in Cheyenne and Dodge City, a network of crooked lawmen systematically stealing land from honest settlers. The marshals spoke in hushed tones about a man named Henry Blackwood, a former judge from Deadwood, who appeared to be orchestrating the entire operation. Laura's gift allowed her to sense the fear in their voices, suggesting this Blackwood was someone even federal lawmen approached with caution. A desert cottontail rabbit that had befriended Laura months ago twitched its ears meaningfully. There was more to this story than the men were sharing. That evening, as Laura tended to Martha's horses, she received an urgent message from her coyote friends. They'd discovered an abandoned camp in the hills, filled with documents that had been hastily burned. Through careful investigation with her animal companions, Laura began piecing together fragments of letters and ledgers that painted a disturbing picture. Henry Blackwood wasn't working alone. He had powerful allies in territorial government. Daniel Moore proved to be a trustworthy confidant as Laura carefully revealed select pieces of information, always protecting the true source of her intelligence. The interim sheriff's integrity had been proven during the Taylor incident, and his determination to root out corruption matched her own. Together, they began mapping the connections between compromised officials, using Laura's unique insights to stay one step ahead of their opponents. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Rachel Turner, a young telegraph operator from Dodge City, arrived with coded messages suggesting Blackwood's organization was preparing to move against Martha's property again. This time through legal channels rather than brute force. Laura's animal friends confirmed that surveyors had been secretly measuring adjacent lands, likely preparing fraudulent documentation. As summer stretched into autumn, Laura found herself at the center of an expanding web of allies and enemies. Her gift of animal communication, granted by that fateful encounter with the Comanche princess, had become both blessing and burden. Every creature in the desert brought her fragments of truth, but assembling them into actionable intelligence while protecting her secret grew increasingly challenging. The desert itself seemed to be taking sides in the brewing conflict. Dust storms concealed the movements of Blackwood's agents, while clear nights allowed Laura's nocturnal friends to track their activities. She learned to read the changing patterns of animal behavior as warnings, noting how the wildlife adjusted their routines when danger approached. The land itself was speaking through its creatures, and Laura Anderson had become its interpreter. Charlie Walker's newspaper articles began appearing in papers across the territory, carefully exposing pieces of the corruption without revealing their sources. Each published story caused ripples of reaction that Laura's animal companions observed and reported. Officials made midnight rides between towns. Documents disappeared from courthouse records, and new players emerged from the shadows of frontier politics. Martha Clark's ranch had become an unofficial headquarters for their investigation, with Daniel Moore and Charlie Walker making regular visits to compare notes and plan their next moves. Laura's ability to gather intelligence through her unique network of animal friends proved invaluable, though she had to exercise extreme caution in how she presented her information to avoid raising suspicions about its source. The stakes rose higher when Laura's hawk friend witnessed a clandestine meeting between Henry Blackwood himself and several prominent citizens of El Paso. The gathering took place at an isolated way station, but the bird's keen eyes identified each participant. The corruption reached deeper into the community than anyone had suspected, And Laura realized that exposing the truth would shake the very foundations of territorial authority. The scorching El Paso sun beat down mercilessly as Margaret Anderson crouched in the shadow of a massive red boulder, her heart pounding. The gift of speaking with animals had revealed a dark truth. Sheriff Robert Clark was secretly running an operation trafficking stolen horses across the Mexican border. Her friend Running Deer, the Comanche princess she had saved months ago, had helped her piece it together through conversations with the wild mustangs that roamed these lands. Margaret watched as a dusty convoy of wagons wound through the narrow canyon below, hearing the frightened whinnies of horses packed too tightly in the wooden confines. A golden eagle circled overhead, its keen eyes serving as her lookout. The magnificent bird had warned her of armed men positioned along the ridgeline, the sheriff's corrupt deputies ensuring their illegal cargo moved undetected. The previous night, while tending to her father's farm on the outskirts of town, Margaret had overheard a desperate conversation between two prairie dogs. They spoke of strange men loading horses into wagons under cover of darkness, the animals' terror evident in their nervous stamping and agitated calls. When she shared this intelligence with Daniel Moore, the principled young deputy who had been investigating the missing horses, he finally had the proof he needed. Daniel had spent months building a case against Sheriff Clark, documenting suspicious patterns and following leads, but hard evidence remained elusive. The sheriff's influence ran deep in El Paso, with many turning a blind eye to his activities out of fear or greed. But Margaret's unique ability to communicate with the animals of the desert had changed everything. Each creature became an unwitting witness, sharing vital details that helped expose the corruption. Running Deer's father, the Comanche chief, had granted Margaret this extraordinary gift after she rescued his daughter from a pack of wolves. The princess had been gathering medicinal herbs when the predators surrounded her. Margaret, who had been tending her father's cattle nearby, heard the commotion and drove the wolves away with burning branches from her campfire. The chief believed the Great Spirit had guided Margaret's actions that day. Now, as Margaret observed the illegal operation below, a roadrunner darted past, warning of more armed men approaching from the east. She whistled softly, calling to her trusted Mustang Charlie, who had been grazing quietly in a sheltered alcove. The horse understood they needed to move quickly and silently to avoid detection. Margaret had never revealed her gift to anyone except Daniel, knowing others would either dismiss her as crazy or seek to exploit her abilities. The investigation had led them to discover that Sheriff Clark had established a vast network of corrupt law enforcement officials across the territory. Working with unscrupulous buyers in Mexico, they systematically stole horses from honest ranchers, erasing brands and forging papers before selling them at a tremendous profit. The operation had devastated many hardworking families, including Margaret's neighbors, the Taylors, who had lost their entire herd. A rattlesnake slithered past Margaret's boot, pausing to inform her that Deputy Frank Walker, one of Clark's most trusted men, was leading another group of stolen horses through a hidden trail less than a mile away. Margaret knew she had to act fast. Daniel and a small contingent of trusted lawmen from Dodge City were waiting at strategic positions, ready to spring their carefully planned trap. But timing would be crucial. The animals of the desert had become Margaret's most reliable allies in this dangerous game. Coyotes tracked the movement of corrupt deputies, hawks monitored the wagon trains, and even the smallest desert creatures contributed vital intelligence. Through their eyes and ears, she had mapped out the entire smuggling operation. But Sheriff Clark's growing suspicion of a leak in his organization had made him increasingly paranoid and violent. Margaret touched the silver pendant Running Deer had given her, a symbol of their friendship and a reminder of the sacred responsibility that came with her gift. The Comanche princess had taught her that such power must be used wisely and for the good of all. As she prepared to signal Daniel's men, Margaret silently thanked the creatures who had helped them reach this moment. Justice would finally come to El Paso, brought about by an unlikely alliance between a farmer's daughter, an honest lawman, and the wild spirits of the frontier. The decisive moment arrived when a horned owl swooped low, indicating Sheriff Clark himself was approaching the canyon. Margaret knew this was their best chance. The corrupt lawman rarely exposed himself by venturing into the open. She retrieved a small mirror from her satchel, using it to flash a coded signal to Daniel's position. The animals around her grew quiet, sensing the tension in the air as heavily armed men moved into position. Thunder rumbled in the distance as dark clouds gathered over the desert, an unexpected ally in their cause. The approaching storm would help mask their movements and add to the confusion once the trap was sprung. Margaret whispered a quiet prayer of thanks to the Great Spirit, knowing that soon the truth would be revealed and the stolen horses would be returned to their rightful owners. The gift she had been granted had served its true purpose, bringing justice to those who had none. As Sheriff Clark's posse emerged from the canyon shadows, Margaret pressed herself against the weathered rocks, her heart pounding. The animals around her grew restless, a chorus of warning signals only she could understand. A rattlesnake coiled nearby whispered of armed men approaching from the east, while overhead, the circling hawks tracked Clark's every movement through the twisting ravine. Daniel had positioned himself perfectly among the high rocks, his rifle trained on the corrupt lawman below. The stolen horses were hidden just beyond the bend, their soft nickering carrying on the storm winds. Margaret felt a deep connection to them, sensing their fear and confusion after being roughly handled by Clark's men during the theft from the Comanche trading post. The first drops of rain began to fall as Clark dismounted, his spurs jingling against the stone. His deputy Frank nervously scanned the canyon walls, clearly unsettled by the growing darkness and rumbling thunder. Margaret caught glimpses of other members of their gang, Charlie and Robert. Both wanted men who'd found protection under Clark's corrupt badge. The animals had helped her track their movements for weeks, building the evidence needed to expose their crimes. A coyote's howl echoed through the canyon, their signal to move. Margaret stepped out from behind the rocks, her father's old shotgun steady in her hands. "That's far enough, Sheriff," she called out, her voice carrying clear despite the wind. Clark's hand moved to his holster, but Daniel's warning shot kicked up dust at his feet. The corrupt lawman froze, realizing he was surrounded. The storm intensified as Margaret revealed what she knew: the detailed records of stolen horses, the bribes, the threats against honest ranchers. Each accusation was backed by evidence gathered through her unique gift, though she kept that part to herself. The animals had been her eyes and ears, from the prairie dogs who'd witnessed the midnight raids to the eagles who'd tracked the stolen herds to hidden corrals. Lightning split the sky as Clark made his desperate move, drawing and firing in one fluid motion. But Margaret had been warned. A desert mouse had squeaked of the derringer hidden in his boot moments before. She dove aside as Daniel's rifle cracked, the shot spinning Clark to the ground. The remaining gang members, seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons. The rain poured now as honest deputies from Cheyenne, summoned days ago by Margaret's evidence, emerged to take the criminals into custody. The stolen horses whinnied in relief. Sensing their ordeal was nearly over, Margaret moved among them, whispering soothing words that only they could truly understand. Her gift had brought justice, just as the Comanche princess had promised it would. Through the sheets of rain, Margaret caught Daniel's eye as he descended from his position. There was wonder in his gaze. He'd seen enough to know she was something special, even if he didn't understand exactly how. The animals around them celebrated in their own ways, the coyotes singing to the storm, the hawks screaming triumph into the wind, even the small creatures of the desert joining in a chorus that only Margaret could fully appreciate. As the storm began to clear and the prisoners were led away, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion. The gift she'd been granted had served its purpose, bringing light to darkness and justice to those who needed it most. The desert itself seemed to approve, a brilliant rainbow arching across the sky as the last clouds parted. The animals gathered around her, not just her usual companions, but wild creatures of all kinds, sharing in the moment of victory that they had helped make possible. Thunder rumbled one final time as Margaret mounted her horse, ready to lead the rescued herd back to their rightful owners. The corrupt sheriff and his men would face justice in Cheyenne, their reign of terror over at last. As she rode, Margaret silently thanked the Comanche princess whose gift had made this possible, knowing that somewhere out there the spirits of the frontier were smiling upon this day of reckoning. The truth about Sheriff Frank Clark's corruption finally came to light as Margaret Anderson stood before the town council in Deadwood's cramped meeting hall, her ability to communicate with animals having revealed far more than anyone expected. The rescued Comanche princess, whom Margaret had come to know as Dancing Feather, sat quietly in the back, her presence a silent testimony to the bridges being built between two worlds. Margaret's newfound gift had exposed not just the sheriff's schemes, but an entire network of deceit that stretched across the desert frontier. Through whispered conversations with prairie dogs and circling hawks, Margaret had pieced together how Sheriff Clark had been systematically stealing Comanche horses, using his badge as cover while blaming the thefts on rival tribes. The animals had told her everything: how he would lead raids in the dead of night, how he kept the stolen horses in hidden canyon corrals, and how he sold them to unsuspecting buyers in distant towns. Her father Daniel Anderson's farm had unwittingly become entangled in the scheme when Clark used their barn to temporarily hide stolen horses. Martha Clark, the sheriff's wife, sat rigid in her chair as Margaret detailed how her husband had threatened to destroy their farm if Daniel didn't cooperate. The room fell silent as Margaret described conversations with the horses themselves, their fear, their confusion at being taken from their rightful owners, their trust betrayed by men who wore badges meant to represent justice. Some council members shifted uncomfortably, but none could deny the precise details Margaret provided about transactions only those involved could have known. Robert Walker, the town's newspaper editor, furiously took notes as Margaret explained how the animals had led her to discover Sheriff Clark's ledger, hidden beneath the floorboards of his office. The book detailed every transaction, every stolen horse, every bribed official. Dancing Feather's own prized stallion, Nightwind, had been among them, though Margaret had helped return him before he could be sold, earning the princess's eternal gratitude and the mysterious gift she now possessed. The council chamber erupted in chaos when Deputy Charlie Moore stepped forward to confirm Margaret's accusations. He'd long suspected his superior's corruption but lacked proof until now. The deputy described how Clark had tried to bribe him into silence, offering a share of the profits from the horse-stealing operation. Charlie's testimony, combined with Margaret's evidence, painted a damning picture of law enforcement turned criminal enterprise. Susan Taylor, the town's schoolteacher, held Margaret's trembling hand as she finished her testimony. The young woman's voice had grown hoarse from speaking, but her resolve never wavered. The animals had shown her truth that human eyes had missed: prairie dogs that witnessed midnight raids, owls that observed secret meetings, and horses that carried the burden of their own stolen freedom. Their collective voice now spoke through Margaret, demanding justice. As the council deliberated, Rachel Moore, the deputy's wife, brought word that Sheriff Clark had fled town, taking what money he could gather. But the animals were already spreading the word. Coyotes tracked his scent. Hawks followed his desperate ride across the desert, and every creature that could move became part of a vast network searching for the corrupt lawman. Dancing Feather's people joined the hunt, their tracking skills complementing Margaret's unique ability to coordinate with wildlife. Laura Walker, the newspaper editor's wife, organized the townswomen to support Margaret's family during the upheaval. The Anderson farm had become a sanctuary of sorts, where animals now gathered freely, sharing their stories and wisdom. Dancing Feather's regular visits helped Margaret better understand her gift, teaching her the ancient ways of communicating with the natural world that her people had long practiced. The dry desert winds carried news of Clark's capture 3 days later. A group of Comanche warriors, guided by Margaret's animal informants, found him collapsed beside his exhausted horse near El Paso. The stolen money was recovered, and plans were made to return it to the tribal families who had lost their horses. More importantly, the exposure of Clark's crimes opened a dialogue between the town and the Comanche people, with Margaret and Dancing Feather serving as bridges between their communities. Henry Taylor, the schoolteacher's husband and town judge, presided over Clark's trial. The evidence was overwhelming: the ledger, Deputy Moore's testimony, and the detailed accounts Margaret had gathered from the animals who had witnessed the crimes. Dancing Feather spoke as well, describing how her people had suffered from the thefts, and how one farmer's daughter had changed everything by saving her life and earning a sacred gift. The legacy of Margaret's courage and her unique ability transformed Deadwood. The new sheriff, Charlie Moore, worked closely with the Comanche to establish fair trading practices and mutual respect. Margaret continued to serve as a trusted intermediary, her gift allowing her to prevent conflicts and solve mysteries that might have otherwise led to bloodshed. The desert frontier, once divided by suspicion and corruption, slowly became a place where understanding could grow alongside the hardy wildflowers that dotted the harsh landscape. Dancing Feather's gift to Margaret had done more than grant her the ability to speak with animals. It had given the town a chance to heal old wounds and build new trust. As Margaret stood at her father's farm, watching the sunset paint the desert sky in brilliant colors, she listened to the evening songs of coyotes and nighthawks. They sang of justice served, of bridges built between peoples, and of hope for a future where the frontier would be shared in peace by all who called it home. As winter settled over Deadwood, Margaret's gift continued to reveal deeper truths about both the human and animal worlds. The wolves who had once threatened Dancing Feather now served as scouts, warning of approaching dangers and keeping watch over the delicate peace that had taken root. Through their eyes, Margaret learned of a plot brewing in the shadows. Former deputies under the corrupt regime were gathering forces in Cheyenne, bitter about their loss of power and determined to reclaim their illicit empire. Sheriff Charlie Moore took Margaret's warning seriously, having learned to trust both her judgment and her unusual abilities. Together with Dancing Feather's people, they established a network of animal observers. Eagles soaring high above the desert plains, coyotes prowling the canyons, and even the humble prairie dogs maintaining their underground telegraph of danger signals. This unique alliance of human and animal sentinels would prove invaluable in the days to come. The winter storms brought more than just snow to the frontier. Frank, one of the ousted deputies, had recruited a band of desperate men with promises of easy riches from reviving the old protection rackets. They began making their way toward Deadwood, but found their usual routes and hiding places mysteriously compromised. Every cave they sought shelter in seemed to be already occupied by awakened bears, every canyon pass watched by keen-eyed hawks. Margaret's father, Henry, once skeptical of his daughter's gift, now worked tirelessly to support her role as bridge between worlds. He expanded their farm to provide shelter for injured animals, and the barn became a gathering place where creatures could share news of approaching threats. The Comanche hunters who once would have been unwelcome on his land were now frequent visitors, sharing stories and strategies around evening fires. When Frank's gang finally made their move against Deadwood, they found themselves facing an unprecedented defense. Prairie rattlers caused their horses to shy and bolt at crucial moments. Wolves emerged from the shadows to flank them, while overhead, eagles and hawks drove their mounts into panic. The gang's carefully planned attack dissolved into chaos before they ever reached the town limits. Sheriff Moore and his deputies were waiting at strategic points, warned well in advance by Margaret's network of animal allies. The confrontation was brief and decisive, with no casualties on either side. Though Frank and his men found themselves thoroughly humbled by their defeat at the hands of what seemed to be nature itself turned against them. They were arrested and sent to face justice in Cheyenne, their dreams of restoring the old corrupt order shattered. Dancing Feather visited Margaret as spring began to warm the desert once again. The two women walked among the wildflowers that had begun to carpet the once barren grounds around the farm, speaking of how their unlikely friendship had transformed not just their own lives, but the very nature of the frontier. The Comanche princess revealed that her gift to Margaret had been more than just magic. It was a test, a chance to prove that understanding between all living things was possible. As summer approached, Deadwood had become something unprecedented in the West, a place where the boundaries between civilization and wilderness, between different peoples and cultures, had grown soft and permeable. Margaret's daily rounds now included not just the farm and town, but regular visits to Comanche camps and wild places where she could speak with her animal friends. The desert frontier, once marked by lines of division and conflict, had become a place of connection and community. The story of the farmer's daughter who could speak with animals became legend along the frontier, though few knew the full truth of it. What mattered was not the magic itself, but what it had revealed. That the heart of the West was not in its conflicts and divisions, but in the possibilities that arose when all its inhabitants, human and animal alike, found ways to understand and help one another. Margaret's gift had shown them a different path. And though the desert remained harsh and challenging, it was no longer a place of endless strife. In the years that followed, other towns looked to Deadwood as a model of how the frontier could be. The corruption that had once seemed inevitable in these wild places gave way to something new. A recognition that the law must serve all living things, not just the powerful. Margaret continued her work, training others in the art of listening not just to words but to the deeper wisdom carried on the desert wind and in the songs of its creatures.